Hey everybody, welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening and welcome to CAF Warbird Tube. This is episode number 135 of Warbird Tube, and tonight Brad Pilgrim is going to take us on a once-in-a-lifetime experience with a very special airplane. We'll hear more about that in just a moment. But if you could do us a favor, if you haven't already done so, please take a second to like, share, or subscribe and follow us. And if you do subscribe, especially on YouTube, make sure you click that bell icon and you'll be notified when new episodes of Warbird Tube get posted. All right. So now as you're watching tonight, you may have some questions for Brad. So just type them in the comment box and we'll try to answer them either during the presentation or before we sign off. So with that, let's turn things over to CAF resident historian, Brad Pilgrim, who's going to talk about a little history of his own tonight. So Brad, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Steve, how you doing?
I'm doing well.
Well, there's certain things in life that you just hope you get to do and probably never will. And this is kind of a little pointless story of how I got to do something that a lot of people have wanted to do. And just by pure luck and generosity of other good folks, I got to do it. There's a two-seat Messerschmitt. Yes, for those who are wanting to be pedantic, I know it is not a Messerschmitt. I know it is a Spanish-built airplane, but it's essentially a license-built version of a Messerschmitt 109. So for simplicity, that's what it's referred to. You could do a whole 2 hours just on the history of these particular airplanes, but in a nutshell, there were 25 or so Messerschmitt 109 fighters that were provided to the Spanish, and they didn't come with engines and they didn't come with the complete tail assemblies. And so basically they were going to be provided later. Well, the Germans lost the war, and so they never got the engines and all that and the numbers that they needed. So kind of to make do, they came up with two different engines, two different Hispano Suiza engines, and installed those in the Messerschmitt 109 fuselage basically, and some other changes and all that. But the original 109 had a DB 601 or 605 inverted V engine in it. The Hispano Suiza was an upright engine, and so it changed the nose of the airplane and all that, but it also spun the other direction from an American engine or from a German engine. Those weren't very successful, and finally they came up with the final version of this airplane called the HA 1112 M1L, which is a single seat fighter. It had a Rolls-Royce Merlin 500-45 and a Rotal propeller on it. And the first one flew in March of 1954. And not long after that, they said we need to build a two-seat trainer of this airplane because they were tearing them up at a pretty rapid rate in landing and takeoff accidents. So what they did was they took one off of the line and converted it to a two-seater. Then they took another one and built it as a two-seater. And there was two of those, and that happened, I think, in 1957 or something like that. I can't remember exactly. But this one right here in this picture, C4K 112, is the airplane that we're going to talk about today. That was the one that was built from the line. If you go to the next picture, this and here's the other one, C4K 35, which was in a ground loop, I know for sure, and was torn up. And then if you go to the next picture, you can see that's the ground loop it was in. And then later on, it was repaired, and then later on, it got in a collision with another airplane that was landing, another 109, and it got taken apart and used for spares. And the other airplane, 112, is still around. This one here was broken up and became a spare parts and disappeared. So the one that we're going to talk about is the last surviving Spanish two-seat 109. They retired them in 1965, the Spanish did, and used them up until then as one of their frontline fighters in the Western Sahara and all that, and retired them in 1965. The CAF found out about these, and I've got several letters people wrote to the CAF saying, hey, over in Tablada, Spain, there's 20 or 30 Messerschmitts sitting around. And so the CF had made inquiries and all that. Well, they all came up for auction, and the CF managed to buy 4 of them and didn't know that this movie, The Battle of Britain, was going to be made. Well, Hamish Mahadi was a guy who was in charge of collecting the fleet of airplanes for this Battle of Britain movie in 1968. And he was trying to buy these airplanes. The CF had already bought 4. He managed to get the rest of them, needed the CF's 4 airplanes as well. And so the CF also bought a Spitfire at the same time. They said, well, we'll loan you the airplanes or let y'all use the airplanes for a cost, and we get to fly the airplanes. And so next slide. This is where Connie Edwards comes in. And Connie Edwards, he's one of those people that no matter how wild the story sounds, it's not even close to what the truth really is. I mean, the guy is he was a living legend. He was just a walking, talking encyclopedia of everything that had ever happened in aviation. He had been involved in it, or he knew the people who were, and the man was not a liar. What the man said was the truth, and he was a very, very interesting guy. I was fortunate to be friends with him. He went over and organized the CF's involvement and everything. Go to the next picture. There's just a couple of pictures of him and the CF. This is Connie sitting down, getting ready to brief. You see the 109s behind it. They're planning out an aerial sequence. You go to the next picture. And that's Lefty in the center is Lefty Gardner, and then on the right there is Connie under the ankle. And they flew all the airplanes in the movies and all that. So you go to the next picture. This is all the CF guys who were involved in the entire, in the movie and all that. And at this point, Connie had already had some creative differences between him and Lefty and Lloyd. And they were still working together, but they really weren't friends anymore. And Connie was either had already quit or was about to quit just any minute now. It just depended on how mad he was that day. If you go to the next picture, that's Connie sitting in a Spitfire, and that's Milt Hardens. He was a Canadian who came down and flew with them some inside standing up on the wing. Anyway, when the movie ended, like a lot of movies, they didn't have the money to pay. This had gone on a lot longer than it was supposed to. Connie worked on the movie for over a year. He was shot down 72 times in the Spitfire and 128 times in the Messerschmitt. And Connie would say, the Brits told me that. He said, I never really knew that. He said, but only a Brit would count how many times somebody was shot down in a movie. But so that's how he was involved with it. Well, at the end of it, there was no money to pay him. Connie didn't need any money. If you know anything about him, he was very well off from oil and ranching and other things that his family, a long time Texas family, had been involved in. So he just took, depending on 16 Messerschmitts and a Spitfire in lieu of pay. And he said you never wanted to take an IOU from a movie company, so he just took airplanes instead. So that's what he did. He took all these airplanes. He flash flew this 2-seat 109 in 1968, and it was disassembled and sent to Big Spring. Go to the next slide. This is what the airplane looked like setting. You can see it has this bubble canopy on it. Kind of looks like a T-28 canopy. It's not the same now. You'll see that in a minute, but this is what it looked like during the movie. They put a camera guy in the back seat. And you can tell when you watch the movie, you can tell which scenes are shot from the back seat of this airplane because you can get a good view of it and everything. It's really lucky to have had that airplane to film views from the pilot's position. And Connie said he got shot in the back of the head more times than any other movie pilot in history, because every time the pilot got shot from behind, it was Connie getting shot in the front seat and getting filmed from the back seat. The next slide. This is how the seats worked on it. You see it had sliding canopies on it. This was changed later on, and I'll explain that in a minute. Next slide. All these airplanes wound up in Big Spring, Texas. I was raised in Snyder, 45 miles away, and I met Connie first. I think I was about 11 or 12. I met him at the Sweetwater Air Show, and his son Tex was a year and a half older than me, and I got to know Tex a little. And later on in years, I called Connie. I said, hey, you told me once I could come out and have a look. He said, well, come on. And so I showed up, and I think I was like 14, and he's like, you want a beer? And I'm like, no, I just want to look at airplanes, but he's just as colorful of a human as you can possibly get. So I got the whole tour of the ranch and the stone quarry and everything, and I got to low down on all the airplanes, and he's like, all right, just make yourself at home. holler when you're ready to leave. And so you go to the next slide, and I went for several years. I went there ever so often, and these pictures were taken. Most of these are by me. A couple were from other people, but they're various stages over the years. But these airplanes, at this point right here, there was 4, 5, 6, 7 109s in this particular hangar, and 2 Mustangs and 2 T6s at one point as well. Next slide. This is all legendary. You can see the Mustang behind it, and then the other Messerschmitt behind that. And next slide. You can, here's the wings stacked up like cordwood along the wall. Everything was there. It was all arranged. And the thing that's neat about the 109, these airplanes, everything's interchangeable from one airplane to the other. It's not like a Spitfire or a Mustang where, yeah, the cowlings look like they're interchangeable, but they may not necessarily be. These 109s, they're pretty much, they're very badly built, as far as the not badly built, but they didn't use ergonomics or nothing when they put these things together, and the cowlings are huge compared to what should be a smaller cowling, but they'll interchange from one airplane to the other. So all this stuff, it was just laying around the hangars and in containers out in the field. So next slide. That's one of the 109s. He still flew this one up until about 1972, 74, something like that is when he continued flying that. His brother Butto got killed in 1976, I believe it was, in a Mustang, and Connie never liked Merlin engines after that. He told me more than once every last Merlin needed to be chained to a concrete block and never fly again. He just thought it was a dangerous machine, but he was going to save all of this stuff for Tex, his son Tex, who was a couple of year and a half older than me. Next slide. There was several. I think there's 4 of these fuselages laying around. This one was just out behind the shed in front of the hangar. There was 2 more over in the carport. Next slide. They were just everywhere. Well, this is the 2-seat 109 against the wall. It's set in the same place. I can say without a doubt, it's set in this same place for at least 15 years without budging even once. And I've got the pictures to prove it from about 15 different years. But if you go to the next slide. That's kind of just what it looked like, just covered in West Texas dirt. But being extremely dry, the airplanes, all of them, were very well preserved for where they were and how long they sat there. 40 years they sat there. Next slide. This is the 2-seaters. This is the instruments panels of it, and you'll see in a minute it looks exactly the same in the back today. It's been repainted, but it's essentially the same. This airplane, they took out a fuel tank and put a seat in there, and then reconfigured the fuel to where there's fuel in the wings, unlike a normal 109, because most of the normal 109, all the fuel's right behind the pilot. So they redid it for this particular kind of airplane. Next one, next slide. That's me. I think I was 15 in that picture. I can't remember. I still have that hat today. If you go to the next slide, I was 19 in that picture. I'm wearing that same hat, and I had the same wallet in my pocket at the time. I used that same wallet till I retired from the Air Force in 2012. No one needed to know that. I just want to say I never throw nothing away. So next slide. In 2013, unfortunately, Tex was killed in an automobile accident out on the highway there in Big Spring. And Connie didn't have, Tex had two young children. I think the daughter was 4 and the son was 2. Or no, the other way around. The daughter was 2 and the son was 4 when Tex died. So there was nobody to leave these 2. And so Connie finally put everything up for sale. And I think I stole this picture from Simon Brown from Platinum Fighter Sales, but this is right before it got shipped out to go to England. So if you go to the next slide. I casually mentioned to my girlfriend, Mary, my fiance now, she's a pilot. She's, flies a Broussard and has an Aranca, a Citabria out here. And one of the smartest people I've ever known, one of the hardest working people I've ever known. And I casually mentioned one time that I'd really love to fly in that Messerschmitt. I showed her a picture of it and a picture of me at Connie's house. And I said, I would sell my soul to do that. And never thought nothing else about it. And I don't know, 6-7 months rolls by. We have Christmas. I go down to her house down here in Houston for Christmas, and she hands me this folder and says, open it up. And right there in my hand is a gift certificate to go ride in the airplane. And then there's that picture of me standing in front of it. Inside there, everything was booked. The trip, we were going to go to England for a week. We were going to go to all these museums. We're going to do all this kind of stuff. in April is what we're supposed to do. Well, about 3 days before we were supposed to leave, maybe 5 days before we were supposed to leave, we all wound up with the stomach flu. I mean, the whole family got it. You know how kids come home from school with the bug and spread it everywhere. And me and Mary both were just heartbroken. We're like, well, you don't want to be this kind of sick in an airliner, over the Atlantic. United Airlines would not appreciate that. So we sadly had to delay it. And so Mary, who was in the emergency room, is on the phone with them over in the UK in the emergency room, rearranged, and they rearranged everything, plane tickets and everything. I don't think it cost anything. We ended up getting the perfect storm kind of thing. So we ended up going in July instead over to Sywell, England. Next slide. We survived our first major fight driving on the wrong side of the road, on the wrong side of the car with no sleep, got to the Royal Air Force Museum, saw all that, spent the first night jet lagged, and finally went out to Sywell, and we're going to go do this ride. And we went to Ultimate Warbird Flights out there at the airport. It's a beautiful airport. I believe it was a Lancaster base during the war. During the Battle of Britain movie, they flew some airplanes in and out of here. Connie had flown here several times. There's a company there that rebuilds Warbirds. They just finished a Hawker Tempest. They have a Sea Fury, a Thunderbolt, TF-51 they sell rides in. The Spitfire here they sell rides in. There's a Sywell Air Museum on field. We weren't able to go to that because it was closed that day. But just a wonderful, wonderful bunch of people. Very nice, very friendly, very understanding that you're spending a lot of money and traveling halfway around the world to do something that they get to do every day. And me, I've worked for the CAF, I've worked for the Kavanaugh Museum and other organizations selling rides and doing rides for people. And I know sometimes you're just like, oh no, one more tourist has got to have a ride or whatever. This is the first time I've really been on the other side of it. And I really appreciate all that the Ultimate Warbird Flights people did, from the ladies in the office to the mechanics to the pilots. They were just unbelievably good people to us. And it was a lot of fun. Next slide. So this is me standing in front of the airplane. This is the first time I had seen it since before it left Big Spring. I hadn't seen it in many years. And they basically rebuilt the airplane. It was complete. It was all there. Literally, it was disassembled in Spain, sent to Texas, put back, never put together, put back in a container, sent back to England. They went through it, changed out all the hoses, changed out all the, the rubber parts and all that, had the engine overhauled by Jose Flores at Vintage V12s. New tires, they put disc brakes on it instead of the original drum brakes, and everybody that I've ever talked to said that you'd be an idiot to fly one without the disc brakes on it today, because the old drum brakes are just not good enough for it. You can see the canopy is different than what it was. It looks like a German Me-109 style canopy. And the purists really get upset about that. Oh no, it's a Buchon, it's a Hispano airplane, it has that bubble style canopy. Well, that came off for a couple of reasons. Richard Grace, who runs the company that rebuilt this, he said the first time he looked at the canopy, he said it looked like if it was shut and locked, it was fine. But there's no way to jettison it if you needed to. And if it looks to him like if it was unlatched at all, it could very easily rip off of the airplane. And he said, so it just didn't seem like a good idea. He said, plus, if you were to wind up upside down for some reason, you couldn't get out of the airplane. There was no emergency way to get out of the airplane. So they built this, and it kind of looks like, if people know what the Me-109 G12 was a genuine German Messerschmitt that they converted to be a two-seat trainer. It has a canopy much like this. So that's what they did. They went and built this, and built this canopy and put it on there. It doesn't bother me at all that some of the purists really upset about that. But they have the original canopy. It's in there in a hangar, and they said if somebody bought the airplane and life wouldn't go on without having that on there, they could put it back on. Next slide. Connie came and saw the airplane, I believe in 2018, and he autographed the vertical fin, and it says, "All the best, Connie Edwards, Chief Stunt Pilot, Battle of Britain, 1968. And so, he went and saw the airplane, and Connie, like I said earlier, he always said he didn't want these airplanes to fly and thought they were dangerous, and didn't really think there were many people had the capability to operate them, is kind of what he always said to me. He was, from what everybody says, when he came to see the airplane there, him and Terry Adams went over to see it, and He said Connie was just tickled to see it and was glad to see it, and he didn't want to go for a ride in it, but Terry went for a ride in it, and they really enjoyed talking to him. They said just the longer he talked, the funnier he got, the more you got from him. And they said they all learned so much from him about how you fly the airplane and how to best do it. And it's funny, if you talk to John Romaine, any of these other guys over in the UK who fly these Spanish Messerschmitts, all of them will tell you that they talked to Connie, that they all called him and carried on conversations with him to learn from him how to do this, because he probably had 800 hours in these airplanes and from flying them around and all that, and loved it. Connie thought it was a great airplane. He told me numerous times that he would fly it against a Mustang or a Spitfire in combat anytime, anywhere. My friend Bud Granley up in Washington, who's a real well-known Warbird pilot, Bud was a Canadian Air Force F-86 pilot, and Bud used to fly Paul Allen's E-model Messerschmitt. And Bud told me many times, he goes, I would happily fly that airplane into combat against anything. He said, you just don't want to have any long distance to go, because that's really where it is really severely weakened, as it just doesn't have the range of other airplanes. But the people who flew it seemed to really, really, really love it as far as its fighting capabilities went and everything. Of course, every air-to-air engagement is going to depend on who's having a better day, who's in a better position. There's so many things, but just on a point-to-point comparison, Connie thought the Hispano was a better airplane, hands down, than the Spitfire or the Mustang, either one. Next slide. This is the back seat of it now, and if you went back and looked at that other picture, you'd see it's exactly the same. It really looks like they hosed it out and washed the West Texas dirt out of it and changed the cockpit, but it's not a comfortable airplane to sit in. I'm only 5'6.5". I'm fairly short. I've got really wide shoulders though, and I fit in the airplane pretty well. If you were much over 6 foot, I think you would have a harder time sitting in it, especially the front seat. The problem with it is you kind of lean back. I don't know what the angle is, but you lean back in the seat when you sit in it. In the back, you have to hold your feet up onto the rudder pedals. And the rudder pedals are very narrow. They're not very far apart. There's not much space in between them. There's nowhere else to put your feet except on the pedals or in between the pedals. That's the only places to put your feet back there. So from a flying standpoint, you can move everything, but if you're much bigger than I am, you're going to have a much harder time doing it. You could do it, but it's not going to be easy. The other thing is the parachute. You have to put the parachute on outside of the airplane, because there is nowhere to put your elbows behind you when you sit down, so you can't get in and wiggle into your chute. I guess you could if you really wanted to lean forward and all that, but it's far easier to put your chute on the outside and get down in it. Next slide. So that's me crawling up the ladder. There's a step to get in there, but it's much easier to get in and out of that off this ladder. So that's what I'm doing. Mary was taking these pictures, and I was crawling down in it, still sitting there thinking to myself, number one, I shouldn't have tried to tell her how to drive going around the traffic circle. I was thinking that. But number two, I was sitting there thinking, I can't believe this is actually happening. I kept thinking, oh, something's going to happen. Battery's going to pop. Tire's going to pop. It's going to start raining. I just knew at this point it just wasn't going to work, but we kept going. Next slide. That's it from the other side, and you can see the Mustang on the other side of the airplane. That's Steve Jones is the pilot that's in there. Jonesy, they call him. He was he flew for Red Bull Air Races. He was I believe a British Airways 747 captain. Very experienced Warbird pilot. Really, really nice guy. I had heard of him, but I'd never met him before. And he had met Connie, but didn't get to talk to him a whole lot. And so he was interested when I was talking to him about Connie, he was interested to hear some of the backstory and some of the stuff that I knew. And I really enjoyed flying with him. Really, really nice guy. And he told me, he said, after we took off, he said, yeah, he goes, this is my favorite airplane to fly. He said, I'm supposed to tell you it's the Spitfire because I'm British. He said, but this is my favorite airplane to fly. But like anybody, everyone's favorite airplane is whichever airplane you're in at the time, I suppose. But next slide. That's just the happiest kid in the world sitting right there. I'm sitting here wondering, how did Mama Pilgrim's little boy from Snyder, Texas wind up sitting in England in a Spanish airplane painted in German colors with a British guy getting ready to fly it? sitting there thinking, still thinking at any minute something was going to go wrong. But it didn't, and it's one of those things that it just the thrill of being there. I always hear people talk about once in a life experiences, and I always think to myself, well, there's very little that you only can do once. Pretty much, you buy a B-29 riding Fifi, that's not a once in a lifetime chance. You can go buy that again. Well, no, it's never this. You never do this something for the first time ever again. And this is, of all the airplanes I've ever flown in, this was the most anticipated thing I had ever done up to this point. Still is, but I just couldn't believe I was there, and I can't explain enough how much I thought that. So next slide. You can kind of see there I have this is before we're moving, so my feet are not in the way, but my heels are not very far apart and my toes are still on the rudder pedals. And so there's really not much place. And probably 5 or 6 times in the briefing, on the taxi, before landing, Steve would remind you to, okay, be sure, mind your feet, mind your feet, mind your feet. And you could really, really cause someone to lose control of this airplane very quickly if you were to get your feet in the way, because the rudder is just so important on this airplane, especially in takeoff and landing. There's been airplanes lost before because people dropped stuff and it got hung in controls and got their foot hung between things. As a result of that, they tell you to keep your feet up out of the way, but they also don't let you carry a camera or nothing like that with you. And so this picture was taken after we got on the ground, after we landed. All the other pictures that you'll see here in a minute, they have an onboard camera system, a GoPro system that's in there that takes all the other photos, and then you can buy the video, and it's by far worth the money. It really is. So next slide. We're already, we're cranked up at this point, and they're just about to taxi out. And I'm just sitting there staring at everything, watching, amazed at how much the gauges shake. And I mean, I'm trying to translate from kilometers and, kilograms per square centimeter or whatever into something I can understand. And I was going to make notes as I was doing this. So here's the power settings or whatever, but I couldn't carry anything to write with, and I had nothing to write with, and I couldn't translate out of metric anyway. So half of it was in Spanish. There's no German, but there's some English in there. So it was very exciting for me. Next slide. This is not a picture of us. This is a picture from Darren Harbour over in the UK of the airplane taking off with no passenger in the back. But we took off, and the smile on my face, you'll see in the picture in a minute, the smile on my face is really, it's genuine. It's just genuine, ear to ear, slobber flying in my ears from the window being open and everything like that. When you taxi the airplane out, it's really, really tail heavy. And they push the stick forward and really go up to about 1,800 RPM to finally break the airplane away to where it starts rolling. If you did that in a Spitfire, they say you'd flip it over on its nose. On a P-40, you'd flip it over on its nose. But it takes a lot of power to keep the airplane moving, And then on takeoff, it's not as impressive on takeoff as like a Mustang is, or a Corsair or something like that, because on those airplanes you can push a lot of the power in, let off the brakes, and when it starts rolling, push it on up and keep going, and it'll really slam you back in the seat. This airplane, you can't do that. You have to feed the power in very slowly, steady but slowly, until you get the tail up, because it wants to go to the left, and then when you correct it, it wants to go back, and so it gets back and forth. Everybody that you talk to that ever flies a Messerschmitt will tell you, the big story is a quarter of the production was lost in takeoff and landing accidents. Well, maybe not. I know a lot of them are lost in takeoff and landing accidents. The airplane, the landing gear is attached to the side of the fuselage. So you can take the wings off and the gear still bolts to the fuselage. So it's canted forward and then also splayed outwards like this. And then the tires themselves have an inward camber of about 20 to 25 degrees. So if you've got equal pressure on the tires, it rolls straight. But if you've got one tire with a little more pressure on it, like you're leaned over, it will go that direction. And Mike Burke, used to fly Tora with the CAF and has flown every other warbird known to mankind. Mike Burke used to fly the Grumman F3F flying barrel. And Mike told me, he said, it's a lot of fun to fly, He said, you take off, and it's so terrifying on takeoff because that little skinny gear and short fuselage. He goes, you get in the air and you don't even have time to enjoy it because you have to worry about landing the thing. And I think the Messerschmitt's kind of that way. My friend Bud Granley said on the Messerschmitt, he said, a good approach makes a good landing. He said, whichever direction you're pointing when that wheel touches the ground is the direction you're going. He said, and you're probably not going to save it. He said, so you better make a good approach. You better make a good landing. He goes, you can bounce it. He said, but whatever direction you come back and touch down again, that's the direction you're going to go. So we pushed the power up, and I'd like to point out at this time, I am not a fighter pilot. I am not a regular pilot. I've done a lot of flying. I've been a flight engineer, done all this other stuff. I've flown a lot of fighters from the back seat, but I am not a pilot. So this is all just a layman's version, a view of what all is going on here. But I've never seen rudder pedals flash so fast in my life. I mean, you pushed the power up, plane started rolling. You got really loud, not as loud as a Mustang, but pretty loud. The pedals are just dancing. And I'm smiling and my eyes are starting to squint shut because I'm smiling so hard and tears are coming out and all that. And next thing you know, it's in the air and you hear the gear come up and it goes clunk, clunk, and it's a really positive clunk. And at full throttle, Connie says it'll climb out at 5,800 feet a minute. So it's a pretty fast little airplane. So we got up in the air. You go to the next slide. There I am. That's the toned down version of the smile. We were already in the air at this point. Before you couldn't see the edges of my cheeks because they were stuck inside my helmet there. If you look around for somebody like me who has studied the war so much and studied history so much and watched the Battle of Britain movie so many times, dreamed about doing exactly what I'm doing right there, it's one thing to do it. It's another thing to do it in the UK where you're looking out over the grass. It's another thing to come near a body of water like a lake or something like that. We weren't anywhere near the channel. You look out and you see the water and you think about old Heinrich, in 1940 flying across the channel in this airplane that when he got over there, he had about 10 minutes of time to fight before he had to go back across that cold body of water and get away. Of course, I don't sympathize with them. They were Germans. They were the enemy. I don't care. But it was really neat to fly this and kind of look at it from what they would have seen in 1940. Next slide. That's just another version of the smile. These are all stills from the video and all that. The airplane at this point, they give you the airplane pretty soon after you get off the ground. It's really a nice handling airplane. I think of the fighters that I've been fortunate to fly from the back seat, the only thing that's nicer handling wise is the P-40. The P-40 is just a dream to fly in every way, and anyone who ever gets the opportunity to fly a P-40, boy, don't pass that up. This airplane, though, this Messerschmitt, rolling, it just 2 fingers and a thumb on the stick, and that thing will roll. I guess when you get up around 300 kilometers an hour, it starts to get a little stiffer and a little more, but it never looked to me like it was going to be a two-handed airplane. Mustangs, in my experience, are a lot more difficult to roll at high speeds than this airplane is. Now in pitch, as far as doing a loop or whatever, it's a pretty heavy airplane in pitch. It's got a pretty heavy elevator, and even trimming it, there's no trim in the back, but when you trim the airplane, if you're trimming like a Mustang or whatever to use the elevators, the elevator trim, you're trimming just a tab. This airplane, the entire stabilizer trims, and so you're having to trim the entire stabilizer, and it's a big wheel over beside your radiator wheel. So it's a pretty intensive airplane if you're going to try to use the tabs, the trim system to fly it that way. It has no rudder trim, it has no aileron trim, it's just got elevator. And so if you trim it, it takes just as much force to trim it as it does just to pull. So, but it's just a really, really nice airplane. Next slide. This is when we're based. This is I think this is at the end of a roll. I can't remember. The airplane is it's a very good visibility from the back seat. Way better than it is in the front seat, and way better than I ever thought it would be. It reminds me a whole lot when you're sitting in the back. It's like an extra or something like that. One of the acro airplanes that looks. You kind of have that view. Of course, the pilot's in front of you or whatever, but you have a really good view up and ahead. You don't have a very good view down at all because the wing's there, but it's really a much better view than you have in the front seat and a much better view than you think. And I think, and even Jonesy thought you could do a really nice air show routine from the back seat because the visibility was better than the front. So next slide. There we are upside down, and the airplane, you could do a roll, then do a 4-point hesitation roll, and then, you know, it just does air shows beautifully. There's slats on the outboard wings, and there's a picture here in a minute where you can see the slat a little bit better. But the slats open and close when that wing gets ready to, you know, a little bit slow and get ready to stall, and you don't feel it, or at least I didn't feel it or hear it, but you could see it happen. You know, a lot of jets have that. The F-86 has the same thing. And when you come over the top in a loop, you'll see at the top of the loop, you'll see the slats drop out. And then coming across the threshold to land, you'll see the slats come out when you start to slow down. So it's kind of like a guy that I've talked about before on one of these webinars that I knew that flew Wildcats in the Navy in World War II. And he flew with his flap handle in the down position all the time because he said it's spring loaded. He said it's vacuum operated and spring loaded. He goes, when you get going too fast, the flaps blow up. When you get going too slow, the flaps come down. He said, so Grumman knew better than I did when I needed to use my flaps. He said, so the entire time I flew Wildcats, the flaps are in the down position. So this airplane is kind of like that with the slats. You have no control over it. They come down whenever they're ready, and they come up when they're ready. And one guy said that he had landed one with one slap retracted and one slat in and are out, and he said it made no difference. Other people have said, oh, it'll kill you, but he said it made no difference to him. So next slide. This is for the purists who say, well, you're flying in a Spanish airplane, it's a Hispano, it's not a Messerschmitt or whatever. Well, the view looks exactly the same. If you take that gun hump off the wing, that looks exactly like it would from a Me-109 Messerschmitt flying over Northampton in England during the war. And I included that mostly just so I really like this picture because I can rub it in someone's face and say, see, I rode in a Messerschmitt, because this is the one picture I have that's in the air that definitely proves it's a Messerschmitt. So I like that picture. Next slide. This is the view from the back looking forward. And even with Jonesy's heading away, it's still a pretty good view. And I used, when we had when I was working for Kavanaugh and we had our Hispano there, I sat in the front seat it several times. And I mean, the windshield is a foot wide and, 10 inches high, something like that. The visibility is horrible. But really, like I said, from the back seat, I think the visibility is better than most airplanes I've seen. And one thing that really sticks out, of course, you can't lean your head out when you're taxiing because you have to have the canopy shut taxiing. The exhaust stacks stick out really far on it, and they do on the P40 as well. So you'd really have to crane to look around those. But this is definitely an airplane that if you had to go a long way on a narrow runway, you would need to S-turn it. And I think it would probably get too hot radiator-wise. I think it would get too hot before you got to the end of the runway if that was the case. But next slide. But we flew around for about 25 minutes or something like that. I don't remember. I was absolutely in hog heaven the entire time and didn't pay any attention to how long we were in the air. I think the videotape from the time we started the videotape and cranked the engine until this, I think is 46 minutes or something like that. And Mary is standing out there looking at me. I think she was waiting for me to get out and propose. And I probably should have at that point, but I didn't do it. But I told her I was going to carry the ring with me, but I didn't, because I knew if I got out of the airplane, I'd be shaking so bad I wouldn't be able to get the ring out of my pocket. So I did not propose on this day. I wanted to savor the moment and give it all to the 109. But anyway, we landed the airplane. One thing that I didn't like about it, and this is purely because I didn't get to fly it very much, the rudder on this particular airplane, it has a booster tab on it. And the others, the single seaters, don't have that. And so the rudder is extremely sensitive. I mean, it takes a little bit of pressure to get the pedal to move, but when it does move, it's very sensitive, and the pedal, it'll just slap all the way to the side. And they told me when they first started flying this airplane, they said the last person to fly it was Connie in 1968. They said, we really thought there was something wrong with the way it was set up. They said, because you could take your feet off the pedals and it would just go one rudder or the other. One pedal go forward or the other pedal go forward, and the airplane would just fly along, in a crab. But once you get used to it, they said they're extremely sensitive, but it's a nice rudder. But the single seaters, they say, are so much nicer to fly. I'll never get the opportunity, so I'll just have to say that you could tell on the video when I was on the rudders, because it, wampered from one side to the other. But I mean, I thought on the slip indicator, I thought I was going to bust that little ball out the end of the tube one way or the other. I never did get a handle on the rudders, and Jonesy said that wasn't uncommon, but it's a lot like a helicopter in that you push in the rudder and then you push on the other one to pull it out. And that's kind of what I had to do on this. I guess if you got used to it, it'd be no big deal. But that was really the only unpleasant characteristic I saw about the airplane. I won't go into power settings and all that. It's basically the same power settings used on any other Merlin powered airplane. It seemed like it was doing about 90 knots on touchdown from what I could tell. The pilot told me, he says, I don't know. He goes, I don't look. He says, I'm too busy. He goes, when I look and the gear's down and the oil pressure's good and the coolant temp's good, he goes, I look outside. He says, because I'm already terrified. And the pedals really, he 3-points the airplane. He said, you can wheel land it, but you nearly always 3-point it. And he goes, because it sets down and the tail wheel's a locking tail wheel, and that will help keep you straight. He said, whatever direction you set down, just like I said earlier, whatever direction you set is the way you are going to go. And he said he likes to fly it off of concrete. A lot of other people like to fly it off of grass because it can slide on the grass. And it truly does depend on who you talk to as to which one's better. But the problem with the grass, it seems, is that grass is never really very smooth. And if it causes you to bounce a lot more, which will cause you to get more load on one gear than the other, which will cause you to, swerve, and then you get into a pilot-induced ground loop. And so it doesn't bounce on the pavement unless it's bouncing on the tires. And so that seems to be the way they prefer to operate it. And I think their crosswind limit, was 10 knots. And they said any higher than that, you're scared to even tow it out of the hangar because it just doesn't look right. Next slide. That's us when we turned in, and he's, Mary took that picture when we're fixing to shut down. You can see the radiator flaps on the bottom there. That's your wing flaps, and your radiator flaps, it's all connected together. So on the top of the wing, you have, flaps that open up for your radiators, but also doubles as your wing flaps. Next slide. So that right there is the happiest kid that ever lived. It was very surreal to do this after having spent so many times, days of my life in that airplane in Big Spring, sitting there, sometimes being lucky enough for Connie to tell me war stories while he did it. Sometimes just me out there totally by myself. Literally nobody at the airport on the ranch but me. To sit in this airplane and get to fly in this airplane that I'd been sitting in and dreaming in, refighting the Battle of Britain in a million times in my life. I never really thought it would happen. And just the simple fact that I was sitting there having just done this, the weather was perfect, the plane worked perfect, everything worked perfect. We flew 8,000 miles to get there to do this. And it's just, you can't imagine, nobody can imagine except unless you've done it, how cool that really was. I've flown in a lot of cool airplanes, and there's a lot of cool airplanes I hope I get to fly someday, but I don't think any of them are ever going to compare to this, just for the sheer cool level of something that I wanted to do since I was a little kid. So next slide. So that's me standing on the outside of it. It's funny to mention, whenever I went into the building to get suited up to go fly, they weigh you and everything like that for CG purposes. And on the Spitfire, it's a lot more critical than it is the 109. But they ask you, okay, what size, how big are you and all this, to try to figure out what size flight suit you wear. I was able to tell them, I said, I need a 42 short, because that's what I wore in the Air Force. It occurred to me when I was looking at this picture when I was uploading it, that 42 is starting to get a little bit snug. When I started flying in the Air Force, I wore a 38 short. When I retired, I was wearing a 42. Now that 42 is about to turn into a 44. So I don't know. Next slide. This is me and Jonesy standing in front of the airplane. Like I said, really, really cool guy, exceptional pilot. He flies a lot of other airplanes. He flies the Thunderbolt and the Sea Fury and the Mustang, and he's a former aerobatic champion. He's the primary pilot, it seems, for rides over there for this Ultimate Warbird Flights place. Really, really neat guy, and he's also into old racing cars and stuff like that. And it was really neat to fly with him over the UK, and I guess it'd be like flying with me over Texas, saying that's so and so's house, that's so and so's house. He's pointing out all these disused airfields that have been turned into car parks and trailer parks and all that, and they're everywhere. And he said you get closer to the coast, there's just hundreds of them out there of airfields that are no longer airfields. He said it really was. He said the UK really was a floating aircraft carrier basically during the war, and it was just in that short area, area we flew around. There's a lot of airfields out there that have been turned into other things. Next slide. That's me and Mary standing in front of the airplane. You can see the intake there on the grill. That's the Buchon smile, as people call it. It looks like it's smiling, and I think it's one of the coolest airplanes ever, not just because of what it is, but because of my experience with it as a kid and growing up, but also the fact that it's been restored and it is the only Messerschmitt of any kind, Spanish or otherwise, that you can go purchase a ride in. And we never know how long the ability to fly these airplanes and do rides is going to last. Even if that airplane was in the U.S., owned by an American, we couldn't sell rides in it because it's foreign built, and we can't do that. So that's why you can't buy Spitfire rides over here. That's why there's 8 or 9 Spitfires in the UK that you can buy rides in, because you have to go over there to do it. If you ever find the way, if you ever have the ability, I don't care if you have to sell your children and not let them go to college and mortgage your mother, go over and fly in this Messerschmitt while the chance is still here. Everything has a price, and someday that airplane will get sold to somebody else who won't do this. Go get you a Messerschmitt ride, because that right there is the only chance you will ever have to do this unless you buy your own. Next, Jade. That's my little certificate, and it's on the shelf behind me here, saying that I got to fly in the airplane, and it talks about the history of it, how during the Battle of Britain movie, Adolf Galland and Robert Sanford Tuck, a Luftwaffe ace and a RAF ace, they went out and flew together in this airplane. And there's some dispute over whether or not that actually happened. There was just a photo op. Connie Edwards said it happened. There's no two ways about it. He said it genuinely happened. And he said that their Pedro Santa Cruz, who was the Spanish chief pilot, who had flown real Messerschmitts in the Spanish Civil War in the 30s, he was still flying these Hispanos, and he had like 4,000 or 5,000 hours in these things. And he checked Adolf Galland out in this airplane, and then he went out and flew it. And then Connie says Galland took Connie's 109, one of the single seaters, and did an impromptu air show over the airfield there in Spain. So it's a very historic airplane because of what it is, but also because of the people who have flown it. There's not too many airplanes that have been flown by genuine aces from, heroes like that from World War II. Next slide. That's Mary in front of their Mustang, and I think that's funny because the airplane's named Contrary Mary. Mary's not. She's a very hardworking civil structural engineer, loves airplanes, like I said, for whatever reason, puts up with me, shares her family with me, and I've gotten unbelievably lucky in so many ways. But finding Mary is one of those things that you just can't choose your own luck. It either happens to you or it don't. And I'm grateful that it is, and I'm grateful that she did this for me. I could have done it on my own, but I never would have, because I'm far too cheap. I can tell you that. But I am unbelievably thankful to her for taking me to do this, and I don't need anything for Christmas or birthdays for the rest of my life, because this was the greatest present that you'll ever get. Next slide. I'm very thankful for Connie Edwards. This picture of him when he's flying a Spitfire in the movie and all that. If Connie hadn't had the foresight to save these airplanes, if he hadn't have taken these airplanes and brought them back, if he hadn't have left them sitting for 40 years in his hangar, they were not barn finds like everybody says. Oh, just found in the barn, 20 Messerschmitts, whatever. They weren't barn finds. Everybody knew exactly where they were, and Connie would let you come look at them, and he was happy to show them off to you and talk about them. But if the man hadn't had the foresight to save these airplanes, we wouldn't be doing this, because I seriously doubt, when you look at the number of Heinkels that survived that movie that didn't survive 2 years after that movie. I think there was like 38 Heinkels in that movie, and by the time it was all over with, only 3 of them ever came to the U.S. and flew, and there's only been 2 fly since then, and there's none flying today. The same thing probably would have happened to all of these Messerschmitts, because they just weren't in demand. They weren't real Messerschmitts, they're Spanish Messerschmitts. You know, they're hard to fly, they're difficult to fly. If Connie Edwards hadn't had the forethought to save these airplanes, we wouldn't be able to do what we did flying in it, and there wouldn't be a Messerschmitt to fly. There wouldn't be a lot of other airplanes around too, Mustangs and TBMs and seaplanes, if it hadn't been for Connie Edwards. So next slide. Connie went and saw the airplane over in England, like I said, and I believe it was 2018, and saw it. That's when he signed the tale and told stories about it. And when we were flying along, Jonesy said, "Well, what do you think? Would Connie be happy you're flying the airplane?" And I'm like, I think he would. I think he'd be happy that the plane was flying. I think he'd think it's cool that I was finally getting to do it after all these years of telling him I wanted to. On the other hand, knowing Connie, he's also sitting there thinking how nobody has any business flying those airplanes. He was the only guy who knew how to fly them right or whatever. But I think secretly Connie was somewhere smiling on people flying his treasure trove of airplanes around. He died in May of 2019 at the age of 85, and the man needs a book written about him, and it'll never happen because of the kind of life he led, the kind of flying he did. Was very interesting. Like I said, the truth is, the made up stories are nowhere as cool as the truth is on Connie. One of a kind guy. He was nice to me as a kid, just like Howard Pardue and Bill Arnott, Nelson Ezell, all these other people. But Connie answered the phone when I called and said, "Yeah, come look," and help push this lifelong fascination that I had with airplanes. And I kind of got to do it. I finally got to do it, and I'm glad I did. And I have Connie Edwards to thank. Besides Mary, I've got Connie to thank for this more than anybody, because like I said, if he hadn't had the foresight to save all this stuff, we wouldn't have been doing it today. So if you ever have the opportunity, go over to England, go over to the UK, buy riding the Spitfire, whatever you can go ride in that you can't ride here in the US, go do it now while we still have the ability to do it. That's not a political speech or nothing. That's just the economics about this business. That's the truth of the laws and the regulations on this business. The day is going to come where someone just snaps their fingers and says no more flying, in these old airplanes, or it's just going to get too expensive to do it. Go do it while you can. Don't stand here someday and say, "Boy, I wished I'd have went and done that." So, like I said, I'm not a pilot, not a fighter pilot. I'm just fortunate enough to have flown in a lot of them and gotten to fly a lot from the back seat. That's kind of my non-technical description of what it was like to fly the airplane. Coolest thing I've ever done in an airplane, no doubt. And I hope everybody else that wants to gets to go do it someday.
Sounds good. The fascination, the lifelong attachment to this particular airplane. When you got to the airfield and you saw it, remembering what it looked like when it was at Connie Edwards Ranch, what was your reaction to seeing it that very first time?
First thing I thought was, where'd all that dirt go? Because if you ever went into Connie's storage hangar, well, even the hangars where the flying airplanes were kept, they were filthy. I mean, just it's West Texas. You lived in Midland, you know how it is. You can't do nothing without the dirt getting on it. But I mean, I never saw this airplane when it wasn't dirty. And I know it's been repainted because they stripped it down to bare metal when they did it. But I thought to myself, so that's really what it looks like. That's really what the colors are. Because my whole life, I went back and looked at pictures when I got home, and I was amazed at how dirty that airplane always was my entire life. But it spent years sitting in a container and then got rolled into a hangar, and like I said, sat in that same spot for at least 15 years. So that was my first thought was, my gosh, somebody finally cleaned it. That was my first thought about it.
When Mary gave you the present, was there a moment where you thought, "No, wait, this isn't real. This is a joke"? Or
I thought that right up until we drove to the airport and went into the United Club and waited for our flight to board. I really did, but I knew I mean, I knew it was serious, and I knew we were really going to do it, but I just kept thinking something will come up.
Right.
Something's going to come up. I'm going to have to go to work. She's going to get called out on a job. Something's going to happen. It's just weather's going to be bad, And then when we all got sick,
Yeah.
I go, no, Well, some things are meant to be, and it winds up that weekend that we would have been there, the weather was horrible anyway. So the Lord has a plan. Everything works the way it does for a reason, But I couldn't believe that she had given me that. I've seen a lot of people walk up and buy rides for people on the B-29. I've seen a lot of people walk up and say, yeah, I'd really like to fly on that B-29, but I just can't afford, $1,800 to ride in the front seat. And I've seen the guy in line beside him give him the credit card and buy it for him. You can buy a lot of B-29 rides for what this costs. I can tell you that. It's really no more expensive than any other fighter, but the cost of getting over there and all this kind of stuff, that's where it really gets expensive. But it's the first time someone's ever spent that kind of money on me. I've watched other people spend it. I've spent a lot of money on other people, nothing like this, but it was really cool to have somebody who knew what this meant to me and understood what it meant to me and how bad I wanted to do it, and heard me say it one time. And then I never mentioned it again. I just casually mentioned it in passing, and she didn't forget that. So I've been carefully listening since then for the last 2 years. What did she say? What did she say she wants? What did she, what am I ever going to get that adds up to this? I'm like, you want to ride a Spitfire? No, that's fine. We'll do it some other time, Well, okay. So, but like I said, she thought I was going to propose. I didn't. She also thought I was going to propose the next day when we went on this dinner train in the UK. But the train, we had trouble with the train. It was a pain in the rear end. It was a lot of fun, but it just wasn't right. So when we were standing in front of Big Ben, that's when I finally said, so is this an iconic place to you? She goes, oh yeah, when I think of the UK, I think of Big Ben. So I whipped that ring out of my pocket and handed it to her. She's like, well, okay, this is a good time to propose. So that's how that happened.
Oh,
and
awesome.
That's better than dropping it in the floor of a Messerschmitt, I suppose, and just assemble the airplane and get a ring out.
That's right. That's right. Roy just typed in something. He says, awesome presentation, as always, Brad.
Thank you.
He said, good to see you and Mary a couple of weeks ago. I guess at 6'5", I'm never going to fit in that machine. And
no.
Yes, Mary is an amazing fiance.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. No, you wouldn't even be able to get in it. And you're Ronnie Gardner, who's a Hall of Fame member, long-time CF guy. Ronnie's flown everything known to man. And Ronnie never did fly the CF's Messerschmitts. Probably, maybe the only airplane he never flew because he couldn't fit in them. Because you can't, he's so tall, he can't bend his legs right to get underneath the panel. So really, if you were over 6 foot, I don't think you could even get in the airplane and be comfortable enough to fly it.
Any last thoughts on this, like you said, once in a lifetime experience that you'd like to share before we close out?
If you ever have the means and you have the ability, go do it. You will not regret it. You may, unless you just don't want them. Don't let the fact that it's a Spanish Messerschmitt, not a German one, stop you from flying it. This is as close as you will ever get unless you buy your own Messerschmitt. And most of the 109s flying today, or at least a good portion of them, the German ME-109s are mostly Buchons, right. The wings or something came. There's ways to tell, but it's, if you want a Messerschmitt, that's the only way you're going to get to riding one is to buy one or go riding this one. So go do it. You will not regret doing it. And the people at Ultimate Warbird Flights are wonderful people. So pay them some business.
There you go. All right, Brad. Again, thank you for sharing that experience with us.
Thank you.
I'll bet you're still smiling about that.
Oh yeah. Oh, I all the time. I watched a video today and I'm giggling like a little school kid over here. So it took me a long time to get the slobber out of my ears when it rolled in there whenever we were doing loops. It was so neat, such a neat thing. There's other airplanes that are cool too, but nothing will ever beat that.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
Oh, yeah.
All right, well, thanks for joining us tonight. And as always, if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear about or have any feedback on any of our shows, just send Leah Black an email at media@cafhq.org. Again, Brad, thank you for sharing your experience with us. And until next time, from the Commemorative Air Force, I'm Steve Buss. Have yourself a good night.